This is exactly how I would learn Python web development if I was starting completely from scratch. Now, I've been writing Python code for now well over 10 years. There are tons of modules, tons of libraries, and things are constantly changing. But when it comes to web development, there is a path that just makes a lot of sense to learn these topics in, so that you spend the least amount of time learning and the most amount of time actually doing and building the skills that you need to, well, build web applications and land a job. So that's what I'm going to do in this video. I'm going to give you a complete kind of broken down roadmap explaining every topic you should learn, in which order and why. Let's get into it. Okay, so the absolute first thing I would do if I was trying to learn Python web development is learn the absolute fundamentals of web development. Before I even start writing any Python code, I want to understand what web development is, what it actually means, and some of the key terms. So for example, I would want to understand things like a browser. What is that? What actually is a web browser? How does that work? What is the meaning of a client, for example, right? That's like the user's device. What is a server? What does a server look like? How does it run? How does that communicate with a client or a web browser? I want to understand things like HTTP, Hypertext Transfer Protocol, right? What is that? I also want to learn about requests and response. What is sending a request? What is getting a response back? I want to look at things like JSON, right? JavaScript object notation. How is that used in web applications? And then lastly, the web app architecture overall. So what actually happens when you go to Google, you type in a URL, you visit a website, and you do something on the website? What is that architecture and what is that flow of kind of operations and data? Now, once I learned that, I would move into all of the tooling that I needed to learn in order to be an effective web developer. Now, these are tools that I wish I had learned way earlier in my web development journey, which is why I'm putting them here. Now, the first tool is actually just going to be the programming language, which is Python, right? You can't be good at Python web development unless you understand Python. So you need to know all of the fundamentals, if statements, functions, classes, object-oriented programming, right? Variables, operations, arithmetic, all of that kind of stuff. I have many roadmaps on my channel that break down how to learn Python, because learning Python is different than learning Python web development. And if you keep going through the rest of this video, I'm going to assume that you have the Python fundamentals down, right? At least that's the order in which I would do it. Now, once you learn the Python fundamentals, I also highly recommend having some familiarity with HTML and CSS. While you may not actually need to write a ton of HTML and CSS, you should know the basics. You should understand simple tags, styling, classes, IDs, all of that kind of stuff. In order to be a competent web developer, you really just have to have some familiarity in that space. Again, not hundreds of hours of experience, but watched a few videos, written a few simple websites with HTML and CSS. That's enough. Now next, you need a little bit of JavaScript basics. Again, don't need to be an expert here. You don't need to be as good as you would in Python, but you need to know what JavaScript is, how you write it, where it's used, and some basic functionality and syntax that you can actually interact with your sites. Generally speaking, Python is very good for back-end web development, but if you want to be a full-stack web developer, you need to understand that HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, which allows you to really interact with the more complex sites that you build in Python, okay? Next, we have a tool called Postman. Now, Postman is a really nice graphical user interface that allows you to send network requests and to test calling APIs. So you can look up Postman tutorial, for example, on YouTube. You can spend 20 minutes, you'll learn what it is, and this allows you to simulate network requests and send them without having to write a bunch of code. Very useful tool. The next tool that I recommend learning is something called curl. Now, this is a CLI tool or command line interface tool. Same thing as Postman. It allows you to send network requests, except there's no graphical user interface. You simply do it from the terminal, which is quite useful as you get a little bit more advanced. So you can do it with a command and you can do it in any environment, even if you don't have Postman installed. Next tool on my list is going to be the network tab in Chrome. So if you right-click in Chrome and you press Inspect, there's a tab that you can go to that says Network. This shows you all of the network requests that are happening when a website is loaded, essentially. This is a really great tool that allows you to help debug your websites when you build them later on. So you should simply just know this exists. If you open up Chrome or even Explorer or whatever, you can go to this Network tab, you can look at it, and you can see all the stuff that's happening in there, which is just really good to know. And then the last thing that I recommend in this section here is to understand some key terms. So for example, API, this stands for Application Programming Interface. The next term is GraphQL. This is another kind of form of API, it works a little bit differently. And then things like WebSockets and SSE. Now, these are different transport mechanisms, ways of essentially exchanging information over the internet. You don't need to be an expert in them. You don't need to write your own GraphQL endpoint, your own WebSocket server, or anything like that. But you just need to be aware that these things exist and that you can do all kinds of different kind of transportation of data essentially on the internet, not just with the standard format, which most people know, which is called an API. Okay, now I know this seems like a lot of stuff, but these are really fundamentals that if you learn them at the beginning and you get these tools down, it will make your life significantly easier. Now, later in this video, we're going to talk about deployment, which is really the final piece of the puzzle after you've learned about web development and you know how to build APIs and websites. Now, this can be tricky, but there's some great tools out there that make deploying your sites a lot easier, and one that I use a ton is called Railway. Now, honestly, this is one of the easiest ways that I've found to deploy services, and instead of wrestling with servers, configs, and observability tools all pieced in different places, Railway just gives you this super clean platform where you can go from code to production in literally a single click. Now, what I really like about Railway is that you're not paying for big, over-provisioned instances that you don't actually use. You only get charged for the CPU and memory that your services are actually consuming, and everything scales up or down automatically. They report companies save an average of over 65% compared to traditional cloud providers, and I've spun up databases, APIs, and even full stack apps in minutes, and there's a marketplace with over 1,500 templates right now. So you can deploy almost anything instantly without having to do a ton of setup. Now, the developer experience is just as smooth. Connect the GitHub repo that you want to deploy and get integrated logs, networking, and one-click environments for every pull request. It feels like the infrastructure side just disappears and you can focus on building. It's also especially good for Python websites and APIs, which is why I'm mentioning it in this video. If you want to try it out, Railway's giving you $20 in free credits, which covers about a month free on their Pro tier. So you can actually deploy the projects that I suggest in this video. Just head to the link below to get started, and a massive thank you to Railway for sponsoring this video. Again, I'd probably mention them anyways because I use them a ton and they are the best for these type of deployments. So at this point, let's assume that you've got the basics down, you understand the core components of web apps, and you kind of know what web development actually is. You've heard of something like an API, you've looked at some of these tools, you've messed around in the network tab. Now it's time to actually start building your own websites and APIs. Now I suggest starting small and simple, and the first thing you're really diving into here being Flask. Now, Flask is a lightweight web framework in Python that is very simple to use. It's very beginner friendly, and it lets you create websites where you can actually have some HTML rendered to the screen, for example. It lets you create APIs, and really anything that you could do with any other kind of website, you could build with Flask. It's just extremely simple, and it's the best for really simple web applications. So what I suggest is start by building some really small applications. Go on YouTube, look up Flask tutorial. I have many, for example. Go through, build a simple website. Build a simple API. Learn about something like routing, for example. Okay, when I go to /home or /logout or /signin, what actually happens? Learn about something called the templating engine. In Python, there is a very popular practice of using templates. This is kind of a mix of Python inside of HTML, and you can do some really interesting stuff there to create like full stack websites. So you have a front end and you have a back end with minimal extra code, JavaScript code, React, things like that. You can just do it kind of mostly with Python. So learn about that. It's called a templating engine. Then you need to practice calling APIs. So how do I write a simple API endpoint? How do I actually trigger that endpoint? If you can do that with Flask, you're well on your way. And this is really where I suggest everyone start getting comfortable with the Flask framework. Okay, so let's move on to the next topic now, which is going to be FastAPI. So FastAPI is the natural next step after you learn Flask. Flask is more beginner friendly, it's simpler, it's not really used in a ton of production settings. FastAPI, on the other hand, is really the standard now when it comes to building APIs in Python. Right, and when we talk about web development, a huge component of that in Python is application programming interfaces, which is backend running on the server. Okay, so when we talk about FastAPI, this is just the most popular framework aside from Django, which we'll talk about later. And within FastAPI, you need to learn about a few different components. For example, you need to learn about the auto documentation. One of the main advantages of FastAPI is its auto documentation, which means that based on the way you write the code, it will automatically provide documentation and ways to test your website for you. Now, it's able to do this based on the typing system that's built into FastAPI. It uses something called Pydantic, which is something that you'll need to learn about when you start looking into FastAPI so you can understand how to type your Python code so that it can be auto-documented. Now, this also goes with things like validation and schemas, which are things that you need to look at with inside of this framework, and then learning about things like query parameters, request body, response, session, cookies. These are the things that you'll need to look at in this framework. Now, I'm not going to go over every single little detail here. I have many tutorials on FastAPI on this channel. The point is, now you want to start getting into FastAPI and almost exclusively use this for all of the APIs that you're writing. I suggest building a simple project here, something like a CRUD application, where you can create, read, and update data that you store in some kind of in-memory database. That's a really good way to get started with this and learn the basics of FastAPI. So at this point, you would have written a few APIs in both Flask and FastAPI. You should be familiar with the request structure, the response structure, kind of the architecture of a web application, sending requests, how you deal with specific pieces of data, the different HTTP methods like get, put, post, delete, for example. And now it's time to look at databases. APIs are really not that useful unless they can actually store data persistently. So in this section, I want to talk about databases and ORM, which is an object relational mapping. Now, first things first, you should understand NoSQL databases and SQL databases and the difference between them. NoSQL being a document store database, something like MongoDB, and SQL databases being more traditional and more rigid, things like PostgreSQL. Now, within Python, it's very common to use something called an ORM. ORM stands for Object Relational Mapping. This is essentially a way to map database operations to native Python code, or I guess not native, but like third-party Python code that allows you to avoid having to write SQL, which is structured query language, which is kind of like another programming language that you don't actually really need to learn if you want to be a Python web developer. So learn about things called ORMs, right? Object Relational Mapping. They exist inside of FastAPI, they exist inside of Flask, they exist inside of Django, which we'll talk about later. The most popular one to look at is called SQL Alchemy or SQL Alchemy. This is for SQL databases. And then there's another one called Beanie that you can use for NoSQL databases like MongoDB. There's a few other ones as well, but generally speaking, you need to understand ORMs and how those work inside of a framework like FastAPI. Now, beyond that, you also really need to look at understanding relationships and data models. So when it comes to using these ORMs, you don't need to be an expert in SQL, which is the programming language for, well, SQL databases, but you do need to understand how you can relate data together. For example, we have relationships like one-to-one, just one connection between these two data entities. We have one-to-many. For example, one teacher might have many students, right? That's a relationship that you could have. And then you have many-to-many. So like many books have many pages. That's actually a pretty bad example in terms of the data. I can't think of one on the top of my head, but the point is you can have many objects associated to many other objects where it's this kind of complex web. There's all kinds of different associations or relationships that you can make. You need to understand what those are and how you make the right relationships when you're designing your data, because that's very, very important. Then you also need to understand data models. So what kind of fields or values do you store in your database, in your ORM, your object relational mapping? For example, if you're storing a user, you need their username, their first name, their last name, their date of birth, what time the user was created, if it was modified, if it's an admin, all of that kind of stuff, right? So the more you can learn about this, the better. So now we move on to what is objectively one of the hardest parts of web development, and that is authentication and authorization. Now look, it's really cool to build websites, right? It's cool to even build APIs, but they're not that useful unless we can actually do things securely. For example, Facebook is not a very useful application unless we know what user is signed into our app, because those users have different permissions. We need to identify who's using the app, who's posting or liking or leaving a comment, or if they have access to a certain dashboard or page. You get the idea. Security is a massive component of web applications, and it all really comes down to authentication and authorization. So the first thing that you need to look at in this section is something called JWT tokens. Now this stands for JSON Web Tokens. They are a very common type of authentication that is implemented in web applications. You need to learn what they are, how they work, and how you can implement them inside of a framework like FastAPI. Then you need to look at things like OAuth flows. Now, OAuth is a standard authentication protocol that is used for things like signing in with Google, signing in with Discord, and it's something that you need to understand so that you can implement it in your apps. Now, as a bonus here, there is a really great tool that makes authentication extremely easy. It's called Clerk, It's something that actually has sponsored my channel in the past, but they're not sponsoring this video. I'm just mentioning it because it's very, very good. It's free to use, and I would suggest that if you struggle with authentication, check this out. Again, CLERK, Clerk, very popular and used for a ton of apps now because it makes it very easy. Now, continuing from there, you also need to learn about something called CORS. This is cross-origin resource sharing. When you deploy a web application, typically speaking, it's going to reject any requests that are sent to a different origin. So the origin is like the server in which this is running. So let's say I have server A and server B, and I have like a web app, right? Let's say server A tries to communicate with server B. By default, my server is going to reject that communication because these are on different origins, different locations, essentially. So you can set up something called CORS, cross-origin resource sharing, which allows you to share resources across origins, right? Across different servers, essentially. However, to do that with a certain permission. So I can actually say, hey, only server B is allowed to communicate with my server A, but I'm going to reject all of the communication from every other server. Something important to look at, and again, just to understand that concept. So at this point, we have gone over a lot. So what I would recommend is, we've learned this theory, we've hopefully built some basic applications as we've gone through tutorials, and we've tried to kind of conceptualize these concepts. And what I would suggest now is doing a full application build. Taking a pause, not learning anything new, and actually trying to apply everything that you've learned to build an application that's interesting to you. For example, try to build a clone of a popular website. Build a blog website, build a, API that can handle payments or something, whatever. There's all kinds of ideas out there. Go to ChatGPT, say, hey, this is what I'm asked to do by Tech with Tim on YouTube. What's a good, app that I can build? The point is you need to build something on your own without going through a tutorial and make sure that you actually understand these concepts. This is always where you learn the most. And of course, I would suggest, always doing mini projects and always working on this, but it's definitely important that you spend some time, maybe a few weeks, building something quite large that you're proud of that proves to yourself, okay, I actually know what I'm doing. All right, now let's keep going from there. So at this point, we've learned Flask, we've learned FastAPI, we have authentication, we have databases, and the reason why I've done it in this order is because you were starting by kind of using everything that was a little less complex. Using Flask, which is pretty simple, FastAPI, which is a little bit more complex, but still simple to understand, and they don't come with like millions and millions of tools that just do everything for you. So you should have a pretty decent understanding of actually how all of these things in web development work. But there is kind of the king of web frameworks here in Python, which is Django. And this is what I'm going to suggest getting into now because this is the most common for full stack applications and really large Python web apps. Now, Django allows you to build just more complicated applications. It has built-in user management. It has all kinds of features that Flask and FastAPI do not have out of the box, and you can install all kinds of extensions that do a lot of the heavy lifting for you. So I suggest looking into Django, building a few basic websites with it, and looking at something called the Django REST framework. Now, REST, or RESTful API, right, is kind of what you've been looking at before. You've been building some more bare bones sites with FastAPI and Flask. In Django, again, you can build full applications, or you can build just APIs using the REST framework, which is quite common. I know it's a little bit confusing, but the point is you need to start looking at Django here and building some apps in this framework as well, so you can determine yourself, do I prefer to use Django? Does this make sense for my project? Or should I use something like Flask or FastAPI? It's important to be comfortable in all of them because if you want to be a Python web developer, you should just know these frameworks because they are the three most common. There's actually a few others as well that are kind of used in the back end that I'm not going to dive into, but the point is these are the ones that you will most likely touch. So now we move on to deployment. Now, once you've got these applications built and they're working in a development environment, someone else wants to actually be able to use them, right? To go to a domain, access the site and have it live so the world can use it. Now, in order to do that, you need to deploy these. Now, there are multiple services you can use to deploy your applications. You can do it just on your own computer. You could spin up a virtual private server. You can use, for example, Railway, right, who sponsored this video and who I use all the time for deploying my sites. There's all kinds of different methods to do this. You can look at these kind of services, but I suggest, regardless, to look at something called Docker and Kubernetes. Now, these are really great tools that allow you to package your application into something called a container, which makes it significantly easier to actually deploy this out into the world. So I suggest learning that. Now, I also suggest looking at continuous integration and continuous deployment with something like GitHub Actions. This is a way where you can automatically test your code and deploy it out to something like a server or Railway automatically anytime you make a change. So you should know Git and GitHub. I'm going to assume you kind of know that at this point. It's not really specific to web development, but it's a tool that's very important to know. If you know that and you have a Git repo or a GitHub repo and you push some code to it, you can have it set up to automatically just deploy the code so that it's live and the world can use it. Now with that, we also talk about testing. It's important to look at things like PyTest and unit test so you can actually test your application, make sure the code is functioning, and then only if it is functioning, deploy it out into the world. There is a whole list of topics I could go into here. I don't want to get into it too deep. The point is, learning some basic deployment is going to be very good. Okay, and then the very last topic on my list here is going to be advanced techniques for web development. This is more when you're getting into the mid to senior level, more for if you actually want to land a job. These are questions you may be asked, but it's worth mentioning in case any of you are at that point. Okay, so the first is going to be rate limiting. How do you kind of throttle the number of requests that can be sent per client to your application? Things like caching, so how do you speed up the execution of your app and make sure you're not constantly recalculating or refetching the same values. Then we talk about things like distributed systems. If you're building a really large application, you're going to have multiple services, microservices potentially communicating with each other. Then we talk about things like background processes. When you're running these applications, you're running them typically in an asynchronous loop, and you need to be careful the types of operations that you do when a network request is received to ensure that you're not blocking other requests from being processed. Again, I don't want to get into it too much, but in something like FastAPI and I believe Django, you can refer to background processes to see what I'm talking about. Then lastly, we have logging and monitoring. Okay, the application's out, it's deployed. How do we log what's going on? How do we monitor the service? How do we make sure we have observability into what's actually happening so we know the app is healthy and communicating properly? Okay, that was it. That's my Python web development kind of roadmap / list. This is exactly the way that I would learn these topics and the order in which I would do it if I was starting from scratch. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you in the next one.